The Milgram experiment is one of those studies that seem taken straight from a suspense novel, yet it happened in real life and completely changed the way we understand obedience and morality. Imagine a group of ordinary people with no special background being invited to participate in what appeared to be a study on memory and learning. The participants believed they were part of a scientific experiment, without knowing that everything was designed to explore how far someone would be willing to yield to authority, even when ordered to do something that went against their principles. In this study, the volunteer, who was assigned the role of teacher, had to administer to another participant, the learner, a series of supposed electric shocks that increased in intensity each time the learner made a mistake while trying to memorize a list of word pairs. The key to the research was that, although the volunteer believed they were inflicting real pain, the learner was actually an actor, and the shocks were simulated. The tension grew as the orders of an experimenter, dressed in a laboratory coat and speaking with an authoritative voice, insisted that the volunteer continue despite the pleas, screams, and signs of discomfort that supposedly came from the learner. This experiment, carried out in the 1960s, revealed something astonishing. Most people were willing to inflict harm on another person simply because a figure of authority told them to do so. What is most unsettling about all this is how the simple act of obeying without questioning could lead to behaviors that many would never imagine themselves committing. The situation became so intense that many volunteers showed signs of distress, sweating, and hesitation, yet they still followed the experimenter's instructions, demonstrating the power that authority holds over individual conscience. Milgram, the psychologist behind this study, wanted to understand why, during dark moments in history, so many people could participate in atrocious acts without morally questioning their actions. Through this experiment, it became evident that obedience can be such a powerful force that it can cause a person to act against their deepest values, especially when responsibility is blurred among several actors, and when the authority figure presents itself as unquestionable. What makes the experiment even more fascinating is the ethical dilemma it raises. To what extent is it fair to subject people to such distressing situations in the name of science? The reactions of the participants have been debated for decades, as many have felt deeply disturbed upon realizing that, under certain circumstances, most of us might follow orders regardless of the consequences. However, the relevance of this experiment goes beyond mere scientific curiosity. It invites us to reflect on the power of authority in our lives and on the importance of questioning orders, especially when they affect the dignity and well-being of other human beings. Every time we hear stories about abuses of power or acts of cruelty committed under orders, it is impossible not to think of the Milgram experiment and of how vulnerable human nature can be in the face of social pressure and blind obedience. It is a wake-up call for all of us, reminding us that critical thinking and personal ethics are essential to avoid falling into situations where evil disguises itself as the fulfillment of duty. The way Milgram designed his study, with clear instructions and a structure that increased the tension with each supposed shock, shows us how small acts of obedience can accumulate and turn into something far more dangerous than we could ever have imagined. Each step of the experiment, from the voluntary agreement to participate to the moment when moral doubts collided with the relentless insistence of the experimenter, is a piece of a puzzle that reveals the complex interaction between the individual and structures of power. Today, the legacy of the Milgram experiment remains present in debates about ethics, in discussions about the responsibility of following orders, and in the way we interpret human actions in contexts of conflict. It reminds us that, under pressure, the inner voice that guides us toward what is right can be silenced by fear, doubt, or simply by the force of an authority perceived as unquestionable. It is, without a doubt, a study that invites reflection and self-criticism, showing us that the ability to question and challenge what is established is essential to preserve our humanity. As we move forward in a world where decisions are made at great speed and hierarchies seemed to dictate every step. The Milgram experiment teaches us the importance of never stopping to ask ourselves whether we are acting out of conviction or simply following orders without thinking about the consequences. Ultimately, this research not only became a milestone in the field of psychology, but also stands as an eternal reminder of the fragility of human ethics when faced with power and blind obedience. The Stanford Prison Experiment was so shocking that it seems taken from a suspense movie, yet it happened in real life and left profound lessons about human nature and the power of circumstances. In 1971, the psychologist Philip Zimbardo and his team decided to transform the basement of a building at Stanford University into a simulated prison in order to study how the environment influences human behavior. To do this, they recruited young volunteers with no criminal records who were randomly assigned to represent two groups, prisoners and guards. At first, it seemed like a role-playing game, but very quickly, an unexpected dynamic emerged in which people began to behave in extreme ways, completely unlike their usual personalities. The prisoners were stripped of their identity, forced to wear uniforms and numbers instead of names, which quickly made them feel dehumanized and vulnerable. In contrast, the guards were given uniforms of authority, batons, dark glasses, and a set of strict rules that gave them the power to impose punishments. What was surprising was how, within a matter of hours, the participants who assumed the role of guards began to display authoritarian and abusive behaviors, applying sanctions and humiliations that exceeded any expectation. This drastic change showed that the environment and imposed roles could shape people's behavior in radical ways, leading them to act against their own principles and feelings. As the experiment progressed, the simulated prison became a scene of constant tension. The prisoners, subjected to an arbitrary system of punishments, began to experience high levels of stress, anxiety, and despair, with some even showing signs of psychological trauma. The sense of claustrophobia and daily humiliation plunged them into an emotional state in which reality seemed distorted. On the other hand, the guards, fueled by the authority they had been given, were carried away by power and began to enjoy the feeling of absolute control, acting in intimidating and cruel ways. This transformation was so striking that many wondered whether it was not the environment itself that had turned them into oppressors, thus revealing dark aspects that lurk within the human being when placed in a situation of unlimited power. The experiment demonstrated in a shocking way that it is not necessarily each individual's personality that determines behavior, but rather the role assigned and the circumstances of the environment. The guards, upon receiving a uniform and the authority to impose discipline, immersed themselves in a role that quickly became real, forgetting that it was a simulation. The pressure to follow orders and the group dynamic created a situation in which empathy faded and blind obedience prevailed. Thus, the simulation of a prison turned into a living lesson about how hierarchical structures can lead to the degradation of human dignity, causing ordinary people to act in ways they never imagined. The most disturbing aspect of the experience was seeing how the established system managed to undermine the individuality and critical sense of the participants. The prisoners, as the days passed, began to internalize their role, feeling incapable of rebelling or asserting their dignity, while the guards increasingly surrendered to their role, justifying their actions as simple parts of a greater function. The atmosphere became so oppressive that even those who initially showed resistance or discomfort ended up yielding to group pressure and imposed authority. This phenomenon sparked an ethical debate that went beyond the field of psychology, as it highlighted how power and social structure can transform behavior and lead to situations of abuse and oppression. The impact of the experiment was not limited to its historical moment. To this day, it remains a fundamental reference for understanding how circumstances can affect human conduct. The way Zimbardo and his team designed the study, allowing the simulation to spiral out of control, has generated intense debates about ethics in psychological research. Many have questioned whether it was right to subject innocent people to such a harmful environment, even if the goal was to gain knowledge about human behavior. The consequences of the experiment have served as a warning about the dangers of allowing hierarchies and imposed rules to become tools of dehumanization, reminding us of the importance of always maintaining critical thinking and empathy, even in contexts where power seems absolute. The legacy of the Stanford Prison Experiment goes beyond the limits of a study. It is an invitation to reflect on how easily human beings can be swept along by the current of power and obedience. It teaches us that circumstances can turn ordinary people into enforcers of rules, and in many cases, into oppressors, if they are allowed to act without questioning the morality of their actions. The experience lived by the participants remains a reminder of the importance of personal responsibility and of the need to create systems that respect human dignity rather than suppress it. It is a vital lesson that urges us not to assume that authority will always act justly, but to remain alert and willing to question situations in which power becomes excessive. The story of this experiment challenges us to look inward and ask ourselves how far we would be willing to go in following orders without questioning them. What would we do in an environment where our identity was threatened by the pressure of an unjust system? These questions are not only relevant in the academic realm, but also extend to daily life, where power and authority in their many forms are present in every corner of our society. The experience of the Stanford Prison Experiment is, ultimately, an eternal warning about the fragility of our values when we face circumstances that can push us to the limit. An invitation to always keep alive the flame of critical thinking and empathy, even when the forces of power attempt to extinguish them. The Asch experiment is one of those studies that, despite its apparent simplicity, shows us in a striking way how group pressure can influence our decisions and even our perception of reality. Imagine being invited to take part in a visual test in which you are asked to compare the length of several lines drawn on a board. The task is simple, and at first glance presents no challenge at all. Identify which of the 3 lines is equal in length to a reference line. However, what seems like an innocent activity turns into a revealing experience about human nature and the need to belong. When you arrive in the room, you realize that you are not alone. In fact, you are the only genuine participant, while the rest of the people present are accomplices in the experiment, instructed to give deliberately incorrect answers. The dynamic unfolds in such a way that one after another, the other participants in the test give their verdict by unanimously choosing the wrong option. Faced with this situation, you encounter an internal dilemma. On one hand, there is the certainty of what you see. On the other, the implicit pressure to be part of the group and to avoid rejection or confrontation. As the minutes pass, the tension increases. Although the correct line is obvious, the group's silence and their unwavering mistake begin to undermine your confidence. It is at that moment that the phenomenon of conformity emerges, that almost automatic impulse to follow the majority opinion, even when, deep down, you know it is wrong. The strength of this social pressure is astonishing. Studies revealed that a large number of participants, despite having a clear perception, chose to adjust their answer to match that of the group. This finding underscores an uncomfortable truth. Human beings often prefer the security of social acceptance over the discomfort of standing out for holding a different opinion, even when that opinion is the correct one. The experience in the room is not just a visual experiment, but a window into the complexity of social interaction. The need to feel part of a group, to not be the outsider or the one who openly questions, weighs more heavily than individual conviction in ambiguous situations. This behavior invites us to reflect on how, in contexts of uncertainty, majority opinions can end up shaping our thinking, even when they stray from the truth. The lesson of the Asch experiment goes beyond the mere act of imitating wrong answers. It is an invitation to question the source of our convictions. How many times have we accepted ideas or made decisions simply because we did not want to break with the general consensus. This study becomes a reminder that social pressure, although sometimes subtle, can be a powerful force that leads us to suppress our judgment and doubt our own perceptions. In today's society, where information is transmitted at a dizzying speed and opinions spread without filters, the Asch experiment takes on even greater relevance. Social media, for example, can act as a massive stage where the majority dictates what is considered correct or popular, pushing many people to conform without thoroughly analyzing the facts or the implications of their opinions. It is possible that without realizing it, we are replicating the same pattern observed in the study, allowing the voice of the crowd to determine what we think, feel, and decide. The force of conformity is, in a way, a manifestation of human vulnerability. We all want to be accepted and fear rejection, which can lead us to sacrifice our authenticity for the comfort of fitting in with a group. But at what cost? By giving in to group pressure, we risk losing that spark of individuality that makes us unique and capable of critical thinking. The courageous decision to hold an opinion different from the majority is, in reality, an act of personal integrity and a challenge to the inertia of collective thinking. The Asch experiment not only exposes how easily we can be swept along by the current of majority opinion, but also invites us to rediscover the value of thinking for ourselves. Every time you face a situation in which the majority holds a view that seems clearly wrong to you, remember Asch's lesson. The authenticity of your perception is a treasure worth defending. Even when you feel the pressure to conform, the experience lived in that testing room teaches us that the search for truth is not always easy, but it is essential for personal growth and for strengthening a society that values critical thinking. It is a call to reflection, a reminder that fear of rejection should not outweigh the conviction that each person has the right to have their own voice and to express their ideas without fear. After all, diversity of opinions is the foundation upon which fairer, more innovative, and more open societies are built. Ultimately, the Asch experiment is a fascinating and revealing story about human nature. It shows us how social dynamics can influence our decision-making, and how, in situations of uncertainty, group pressure can cloud our judgment. Above all, it teaches us that true strength lies in the ability to question, to listen to the inner voice that urges us to be faithful to what we believe, and to have the courage to swim against the current when necessary. This study stands as a beacon of awareness that invites us not to let the desire to belong overshadow the authenticity of our thinking, and to recognize that, in a world saturated with opinions, every individual voice matters and can make a difference. The Little Albert experiment is one of those investigations in psychology that, despite having been carried out decades ago, continues to generate debate and surprise because of the way it showed how emotional responses can be learned through conditioning. Imagine for a moment that you are a researcher and decide to explore the possibility that a young child could develop fears toward things that by themselves do not cause fear. That is exactly what John B. Watson, together with Rosalie Rayner, did in the 1920s. To do this, they chose a child who was called Albert and subjected him to a series of experiments aimed at demonstrating that fears could be acquired through learning rather than being innate. The central idea of the study was to observe whether a neutral stimulus, such as a white rat, could come to provoke fear in the child when it was repeatedly associated with an aversive stimulus, in this case, a loud sound that frightened and startled Albert. At first, little Albert showed a normal reaction and no signs of fear toward the rat. It was simply a new and curious object in his environment. However, when the experiment began, the researchers struck a metal bar with a hammer just as Albert touched or approached the rat. The combination of the rat with the thunderous noise caused the child, after a few repetitions, to begin associating the presence of the rat with the fright and discomfort produced by the sound. Little by little, the experiment demonstrated that fear was not an innate response to the rat, but rather something that had been learned through the association of two stimuli. one neutral, and one that naturally produced an intense reaction. What makes this study so striking is the way it shows us the human capacity to learn emotions automatically, even without a conscious teaching process. Albert's behavior changed drastically. What was initially an object that simply sparked curiosity became something that generated fear and avoidance. This change occurred so quickly that the researchers themselves were surprised by the strength of the conditioned response in the child. The methodology of the experiment consisted of repeating the same sequence several times. First, the rat was presented, and then the loud sound was triggered, so that the child's brain would associate both events. Over time, when seeing only the rat without the sound, Albert immediately reacted with signs of anxiety and fear, indicating that the association had been firmly established in his mind. This demonstration, although controversial, helped lay the foundations of classical conditioning, a theory that holds that emotional responses and behaviors can be modified by repeatedly associating stimuli. However, beyond the theory, the Little Albert experiment opened the door to ethical debates that remain relevant to this day. Many people question the morality of exposing a child to situations that caused unnecessary suffering and that could also have long-term effects on emotional development. Concern for little Albert's well-being became a central point in discussing the limits that should be imposed on psychological studies and the responsibility researchers have toward their subjects, especially when those subjects are as vulnerable as children. Despite the criticism, the study clearly demonstrated that fear can be a learned response, something that has important implications in fields as varied as phobia therapy, trauma treatment, and the understanding of how negative attitudes are formed in society. The ability to condition emotions is not exclusive to little Albert, but is present in all of us in some way. Throughout life, we often develop fears and anxieties based on past experiences in which something seemingly harmless was associated with an unpleasant situation. For example, a person may feel fear towards certain places or situations after having experienced a negative event in those contexts. And that same mechanism of association is what was demonstrated in the experiment. The importance of this study lies in the fact that it revealed the plasticity of the human emotional system and how it can be shaped by the environment. What seemed like a simple game of stimuli turned into a fundamental lesson about emotional learning, showing that our fears do not always arise from what we are programmed to fear, but from the experiences we accumulate throughout life. In addition, the Little Albert experiment has served as a warning for future research, prompting the creation of stricter ethical codes to protect participants from any harm, whether physical or emotional. The controversy generated by its implementation has also allowed the scientific community to reflect on the balance between the pursuit of knowledge and the protection of human well-being. At its core, Albert's story invites us to think about how our emotions are formed and about the importance of being aware of the influences we receive every day. It teaches us that although learning certain emotional responses can be natural and even necessary for our survival, it is also essential to know how to identify and question those associations that limit us or generate unjustified fear. In this way, the Little Albert experiment not only marked a turning point in the history of psychology, but also became a reminder that the power of learning and the association of ideas can be as beneficial as it can be harmful, depending on the context in which it is applied. Thus, the story of this experiment challenges us to be critical of the influences to which we are exposed, to better understand our fears, and above all, to value the importance of ethics and humanity in the advancement of scientific knowledge. The Bobo doll experiment is one of those investigations that revolutionized the way we understand learning and imitation in children, showing in a surprising way how aggressive behavior can be acquired simply by observing an adult. Imagine a situation in which a group of children gathers in a playroom where everything seems innocent and fun. However, in one corner of that same room, there is an inflatable doll called Bobo, specially designed to withstand blows and aggression without being damaged. What happens next will forever change the perception of how behavior is learned, since the researchers, led by the psychologist Albert Bandura, wanted to demonstrate that children imitate violent behaviors not because they are forced to act that way, but because by seeing adult models behave aggressively, they themselves adopt those behaviors as a way to learn and adapt to their environment. The dynamics of the experiment were simple, yet its impact was profound. The children were invited to observe an adult who deliberately interacted with the Bobo doll in a violent manner. This adult not only hit the doll, but also kicked it, threw objects at it, and used aggressive language, all in the presence of the children, who attentively watched every movement. The idea was that by witnessing these actions, the children would internalize that violence was an acceptable response in certain situations, even when there was no immediate threat or justified reason to act that way. What happened was truly surprising. After observing the aggressive behavior, when they were allowed to interact with the Bobo doll, many children began to reproduce almost exactly the actions they had seen. They hit, kicked, and displayed violent behaviors toward the doll without ever being told that they should do so. This finding made it clear that imitation is a natural learning mechanism in which observing someone who is trusted or seen as a role model can decisively influence how one acts. The experiment not only demonstrated children's ability to copy violent behaviors, but also revealed the power of social learning. Instead of learning solely through direct rewards or punishments, children absorbed complex behaviors by watching the actions of adults, as if they were learning through a kind of mirror. This phenomenon is known as modeling and has become a fundamental pillar for understanding how behaviors are transmitted in society. The importance of this discovery lies in the fact that if children can learn attitudes and behaviors simply by observing their role models, then the environment in which they grow up, television, video games, and the behavior of their parents or teachers play a crucial role in shaping their personality. The image of the Bobo doll has therefore become a symbol of how aggression can be contagious and how role models are decisive in people's future behavior. The impact of the Bobo doll experiment has been so profound that it has generated intense debate about the influence of media and environment on children's development. Many parents and educators have wondered whether exposure to violence, whether on television, in movies, or in the family environment, can predispose children to aggressive behavior in real life. Bandura argued that the imitation of aggressive behaviors is not automatic or inevitable, but it is a real possibility if children are constantly exposed to models of violence without adequate supervision or without being taught to distinguish between what is acceptable and what is not. Thus, the experiment not only opened a window to better understand child psychology, but also raised fundamental questions about the responsibility of adults and society in shaping individuals who are capable of resolving conflicts peacefully. The methodology used in this study, although it would today be considered questionable from an ethical standpoint, was innovative for its time and marked a turning point in psychological research. Bandura and his team designed the experiment in order to isolate the factor of observation and see how it could modify behavior without the need for direct punishment or reward. The result was a clear demonstration that children, by imitating the aggressive behaviors they saw in an adult, could learn to act in a similar way, highlighting the powerful influence that models have in society. This discovery led to a rethinking of how values and social norms are transmitted, emphasizing that the teaching and examples set by important figures in children's lives must be consistent and responsible. Every action, every word, and every gesture becomes a lesson that children absorb consciously or unconsciously, and later reproduce in their environment. The Bobo doll experiment has also been a valuable tool for exploring the roots of aggression and violence in broader contexts. Based on this study, researchers have been able to delve deeper into how violent behaviors are generated and to what extent social learning contributes to their emergence. The implications of these findings are enormous, as they suggest that if we want to reduce violence in society, it is essential to pay attention to the models offered to new generations. Education, family, and the media have the responsibility to promote attitudes of empathy, peaceful conflict resolution, and respect for others. In this way, the experiment is not only a testament to the power of learning through imitation, but also a call to action to create environments that foster the development of positive and constructive behaviors. It is important to note that despite the criticism it has received for the way it was conducted, the Bobo doll experiment remains a reference point in the psychology of learning and in the understanding of human behavior. Children's ability to imitate observed behaviors has been confirmed in numerous subsequent studies, reinforcing the idea that modeling is one of the fundamental processes of social learning. By observing how a simple experiment with an inflatable doll can reveal such deep aspects of human nature, we realize that every action we take has the potential to influence those around us. The image of the aggressive adult and the Bobo doll becomes a metaphor for the way violence and negative behavior can be transmitted from generation to generation if measures are not taken to counteract them. Ultimately, the Bobo doll experiment invites us to reflect on the power of example and the importance of being aware of the behaviors we promote in our environment. It shows us that learning does not occur only in classrooms or books, but happens continuously through observation and imitation of those we admire or live with. By understanding this process, we can make more informed decisions about how we act, and above all, about how we educate future generations so that they are capable of building a more just and peaceful society. The main lesson we draw from this study is that change begins with each one of us, and that being a good example is ultimately the most powerful tool to transform the world around us. The Pygmalion effect, also known as the self-fulfilling prophecy, is a fascinating phenomenon that demonstrates how the expectations we have about other people can influence their performance and behavior in surprising ways. Imagine a classroom in which a teacher, without even realizing it, begins to see extraordinary potential in some students, as if a hidden talent were concealed within them. These expectations, transmitted subtly through daily interaction, end up shaping the students' behavior, leading them to reach levels of performance that might otherwise have remained unexplored. It was precisely from this idea that the psychologist Robert Rosenthal, together with Lenore Jacobson, carried out a study that would forever change the way we understand education and interpersonal relationships. In a school setting, teachers were told that certain students chosen at random had exceptional intellectual potential, and that throughout the year, they were expected to show remarkable growth in their academic abilities. What was surprising was that despite the fact that these students were selected arbitrarily and without any real evidence of their supposed superior abilities, a significant improvement in their performance was observed at the end of the school year. This result made it clear that the teachers' expectations influenced how they treated the students. They devoted more attention to them, offered more encouragement, and generally behaved in ways that motivated the students to try harder. Over time, the students internalized these signals of confidence and, in response, increased their performance, thus fulfilling the initial prophecy. What is interesting about this phenomenon is that it is not limited exclusively to the educational field, but extends to any relationship in which one person has the ability to influence another through expectations and attitudes. For example, in the workplace, a manager who fully trusts the abilities of their team and demonstrates that trust can motivate employees to achieve goals that once seemed unattainable. Similarly, in sports, coaches who project high levels of confidence in their players succeed in pushing them to give their best, developing skills and performance that exceed initial expectations. The Pygmalion effect therefore teaches us that the beliefs and perceptions we have about others are not harmless opinions, but can become powerful forces that transform reality. In practice, this means that every interaction we have, every word of encouragement, or even every look of disapproval can influence the way people see themselves and, consequently, the potential they can develop. This phenomenon invites reflection on the importance of being aware of our own expectations and biases, since many times, without realizing it, we can limit the growth of others or, on the contrary, encourage their development. In the school context, for example, it is essential for teachers to recognize the power of their words and attitudes, because a small demonstration of faith in a student's potential can be the necessary push for that student to overcome difficulties and achieve success. Likewise, parents also play a crucial role by conveying positive messages about their children's abilities, creating an environment in which they feel safe to explore, learn, and take risks without fear of failure. The impact of the Pygmalion effect is so profound that it has been the subject of countless studies and debates, and has become a central concept in social and educational psychology. One of the most interesting aspects is how positive expectations can trigger an upward spiral of growth and improvement. When a person feels valued and recognized, they are more likely to commit to their tasks and challenges, developing skills and abilities that in turn reinforce the positive perception others have of them. This virtuous cycle not only benefits the individual, but also has ripple effects on the group or community to which they belong, generating an environment of collaboration and excellence. However, the Pygmalion effect also warns us about the risks of negative expectations. When someone is labeled or underestimated, they may internalize that limited view of themselves and, without realizing it, act in accordance with it, reinforcing the initial stereotype. This phenomenon, known as the negative self-fulfilling prophecy, can be devastating, especially in contexts where emotional support and confidence are fundamental for personal development. For this reason, it is essential to promote a culture of realistic but positive expectations, in which strengths are recognized and areas for improvement are addressed constructively. In the field of education, for example, this translates into the need for teachers to adopt an inclusive and motivating approach that allows each student to discover and develop their innate abilities without falling into comparisons or prejudices that limit their potential. Likewise, in the workplace and in interpersonal relationships, fostering recognition and mutual support can generate healthier and more productive environments. It is interesting to note how this concept has transcended psychology to influence areas as diverse as human resources management, coaching, and personal development. Many leaders and coaches use strategies inspired by the Pygmalion effect to empower their teams and clients, recognizing that the power of belief and encouragement is fundamental to achieving ambitious goals. Ultimately, the Pygmalion effect invites us to be active agents in transforming our environment. It teaches that each of us has the ability to influence the development and confidence of others through simple acts of faith and recognition. By adopting a positive and encouraging attitude, we can help create spaces where human potential is amplified and where people feel inspired to give their best. This phenomenon is a reminder that the way we see others and the way we communicate can be the spark that ignites great transformations in the lives of those around us. The story of the Pygmalion effect, initiated by Rosenthal's studies, remains a powerful lesson about the impact of our beliefs, inviting us to reflect on the role each of us plays in the development of a more positive, inclusive, and possibility-filled world. The third wave is a social experiment that has become almost legendary for the way it demonstrated how easy it is for people to be swept up by authoritarian ideas, and how important it is to question structures of power. Imagine a classroom where all of a sudden a series of activities begins that at first glance seem to be nothing more than an exercise in discipline and order, but that soon turn into an experience revealing the deep mechanisms of obedience and conformity. It all began when a teacher, in an attempt to explain how totalitarian regimes can gain strength, decided to recreate an environment that reflected the essence of authoritarianism without the students knowing the true purpose of the experiment. The teacher began to establish strict rules, emphasizing the importance of unity, discipline, and commitment to the group. Little by little, a climate was created in which individuality gave way to the pressure to conform to a collective ideal. At first, the rules seemed simply like a way to maintain order in the classroom, but over time, they increased and symbols and rituals were imposed that reinforced the feeling of belonging to something greater than oneself. The experience intensified as the teacher introduced elements reminiscent of authoritarian structures, special greetings, slogans in which words of encouragement were repeated, and constant reinforcement of the idea that each member had a fundamental role in the success of the group. Students who at the beginning may have felt some curiosity or even discomfort at the sudden change began to adapt to the new environment. As the days went by, it became evident how social pressure and the desire not to be left out of that movement led many to join without questioning, adopting behaviors and attitudes they had not even imagined at first. The third wave was not only an experiment about obedience, but also a living lesson about how identity and the sense of belonging can be shaped by the force of a group. Each rule, each slogan, was like a brick building a wall between us and them, creating a division that made it easier to justify actions that would otherwise be unthinkable. Students began to see the group as a source of power and security, forgetting that deep down they were giving up their individual freedom and their capacity for critical thinking. This experience revealed something unsettling. In situations of uncertainty, the need to belong and to be accepted can lead people to adopt extreme positions and to lose their sense of personal responsibility. The third wave showed that authoritarianism does not appear out of nowhere, but is built step by step through small gestures and the repetition of behaviors that reinforce the idea of an unquestionable leader and a united group. The teacher, acting as a model of authority, was able to transform the classroom into a kind of microstate in which loyalty and discipline were valued more than individual freedom. The transformation was so subtle that many students, even those who initially doubted, ended up convincing themselves that participating in that dynamic was the right thing to do, unreservedly accepting the idea that order and unity were indispensable for the well-being of everyone. What is surprising is how, in a matter of days, an atmosphere of camaraderie and curiosity turned into a genuine demonstration of the power of conformism. The students, once full of their own ideas and questions, were swept along by the current of the group, adopting behaviors and attitudes that reflected an almost automatic obedience to the established rules. This process, which seemed harmless at first, made it clear that the influence of a leader and the pressure to belong to a group can lead people to act contrary to their convictions and to renounce their individuality. The importance of the third wave lies in the fact that, although it was carried out in a controlled environment and for educational purposes, its implications go far beyond the classroom. It invites us to reflect on how ideologies are formed and how, in moments of crisis or uncertainty, people can be seduced by the promise of security and order, even when this means giving up fundamental values such as freedom, empathy, and critical thinking. The experience of the experiment shows that authoritarianism is not something exclusive to distant political regimes, but can manifest itself in any human group, in any context where division between us and them is encouraged and blind obedience is rewarded. It is a warning about the dangers of following a leader without questioning them, and reminds us of the importance of always keeping alive the ability to think independently, to analyze rules, and to question those norms that seem impossible to change. In everyday life, this phenomenon can be seen reflected in situations as diverse as school, the workplace, or even social media, where majority opinions can end up imposing a single truth and marginalizing those who think differently. The third wave is, in essence, an invitation to reflect on human nature and on how sometimes the desire for belonging and security can eclipse reason and individual freedom. It is a call to remain alert, to recognize that every small gesture and every word can contribute to the formation of systems of power that, if left unquestioned, can lead to situations of abuse and oppression. Through this experience, it becomes clear that education and the promotion of critical thinking are essential tools to avoid falling into the trap of authoritarianism. Although the third wave emerged as an experiment in a classroom, its lessons are universal and apply to society as a whole, reminding us that freedom and individuality must be protected at all costs. Every time we face situations in which conformity is demanded without space for criticism, we should remember the story of this experiment and ask ourselves, am I choosing freely, or am I being carried along by group pressure? The answer to this question is vital for building fairer and more respectful environments in which each person can express themselves and develop without fear of being silenced. Ultimately, the third wave is a living lesson about the power of social influence and the importance of always keeping a critical voice active, so that we never again allow fear or comfort to make us give up what makes us human. The Harlow monkey experiment is one of those studies that, despite having been carried out decades ago, continues to be widely discussed because of what it taught us about affection and the importance of physical contact in emotional development. Imagine a scenario in which researchers want to understand how the bond between a mother and her infant is formed, and how this bond affects behavior and the ability to face the world. Harry Harlow, an American psychologist, decided to study this phenomenon using rhesus monkeys as subjects, since these primates share certain similarities in behavior with humans. In his research, Harlow separated the infants from their mothers early in life and exposed them to two types of artificial mothers. One was a wire mother, to which milk could be attached in a bottle, and the other was a soft, plush mother that was warm and comforting, but provided no food. What seemed like a simple experiment turned into a revelation about the power of physical contact, as the monkeys showed a marked preference for the cloth mother, spending most of their time clinging to her, even when the wire mother offered food. This finding demonstrated that physical contact and comfort are fundamental to emotional well-being, something that goes beyond the simple satisfaction of biological needs, such as feeding. The monkeys that stayed with the cloth mother showed fewer signs of distress and stress, which shows that affection and security, transmitted through touch, are essential for the development of a balanced personality. The Harlow experiment is striking because it makes us question the way we understand attachment and the importance of affection in the formation of identity. The results showed that, although milk is necessary for survival, the warmth and comfort obtained from physical contact are just as vital, because they provide the sense of protection and security that allows an individual to explore and learn from the environment. This research highlighted that physical contact is a basic element for the formation of stable and healthy relationships, and opened the door to a series of subsequent studies that examined how the absence of affection can lead to emotional and behavioral problems. Harlow's methodology, although controversial from an ethical standpoint, made it possible to observe firsthand the importance of contact comfort, a concept that we now understand as crucial in early development. The monkeys who were deprived of a genuine emotional bond showed unusual behaviors such as social withdrawal, aggression, and difficulty interacting with other members of their species. These reactions speak to how deep the impact of a lack of affection can be on the psyche, and how deprivation of nurturing contact in the earliest stages of life can leave lasting emotional scars. In addition, the Harlow experiment helped dismantle the idea that feeding is the primary factor in development. Instead, it highlighted that affection and emotional connection are essential elements for building a solid foundation from which individuals can grow and face the challenges of life. The implications of this study are enormous and extend far beyond the field of experimental psychology. They invite us to reflect on the importance of providing a loving and secure environment for children and for any being that requires care, since human contact, affection, and empathy play a vital role in the formation of a healthy personality. In the context of education and caregiving, Harlow's findings have contributed to promoting practices that prioritize emotional security, encouraging environments in which the value of physical contact and affection is recognized as fundamental tools for social and emotional development. On the other hand, the study has also been the subject of criticism due to the way it was conducted, as it involves separating infants from their mothers and exposing them to situations that caused great emotional suffering. These practices have generated an ethical debate about the validity of certain experimental methods and about the limits that must be respected in the pursuit of knowledge. However, despite the controversies, the contributions of the Harlow experiment have been invaluable in understanding that love, contact, and warmth are irreplaceable elements in the process of growth. Today, many child welfare and institutional care policies have been reshaped by taking into account the importance of secure attachment and affectionate contact, concepts that became clear thanks to the findings of these studies. The main lesson this experiment leaves us is that emotional security and affection are not simple luxuries, but basic needs that allow any being, whether human or animal, to develop in a healthy and complete way. Physical contact, tenderness, and the presence of figures who convey safety are fundamental for creating an environment in which exploration, learning, and social interaction can flourish. Thus, the legacy of Harlow's work remains relevant, as it reminds us of the importance of nurturing not only the body, but also the soul, and of recognizing that a caress, a hug, and a look of understanding are just as essential as any physical resource. In a world where priority is often given to the tangible and material, the Harlow experiment invites us to pause and think about the incalculable value of affection and about how small displays of care can make a difference in someone's life. This study becomes a powerful metaphor for the need to create supportive and caring environments in which emotional security is the foundation for the development of individuals capable of facing life's challenges with confidence and resilience. Ultimately, the Harlow monkey experiment offers us a window into the complexity of affectionate behavior and teaches us that without love and without human contact, the capacity to relate and thrive is severely compromised, leaving an indelible mark that underscores the importance of caring for, respecting, and valuing the emotional component at every stage of development. The Marshmallow Test, also known as the Marshmallow Test, is a psychology experiment that has captured the attention of scientists, educators, and parents around the world because it teaches us in a simple yet profound way the importance of self-control and the ability to wait for greater rewards in the future. Imagine a bright and welcoming room where a group of young children gathers, each one immersed in their own world of imagination and energy. In this setting, an experimenter sits in front of each child and presents them with a marshmallow, a soft and sweet treat that at first glance can seem very tempting to anyone. The child receives a very simple explanation. If they choose to eat the marshmallow right away, they will enjoy it immediately. But if they are able to wait for a few minutes without giving in to temptation, they will be offered a second marshmallow as a reward. This small dilemma, which at first may seem trivial, becomes a powerful tool to measure the ability to delay gratification and control impulses, skills that later studies have linked to better academic performance, healthier interpersonal relationships, and even greater emotional stability in adulthood. The idea behind this experiment is that the ability to postpone immediate reward and wait for a greater one is an important indicator of self-discipline, a quality that influences many aspects of life. During the test, as the child faces the decision, a kind of internal tension is created. On one side, there is the immediacy of the pleasure offered by the marshmallow, and on the other, the promise of obtaining something better if they manage to wait. At that moment, children enter a small conflict between their desires and the possibility of a greater gain. And it is precisely at this crossroads that researchers can observe behaviors ranging from distraction, using strategies such as covering their eyes or singing to themselves, to the obvious frustration of those who cannot resist the temptation for very long. What is surprising is how this experiment, so simple in its design, has revealed significant differences in children's capacity for self-control, which in turn has served to statistically predict important aspects of their future development. Follow-up studies have shown that those children who managed to wait the indicated time not only tended to earn better grades in school, but also showed more developed social and emotional skills. suggesting that the ability to delay gratification is closely linked to the ability to plan, think about the future, and manage emotions. This finding has sparked the interest of many experts who have used the marshmallow test as a starting point to explore topics as varied as resilience, decision-making, and the influence of family and school environments on personal development. It is important to mention that the experiment is not a definitive measure of a person's intelligence or potential, but rather an indicator of how certain aspects of self-control can influence the course of life. In addition, the context in which the test takes place can have an important impact. For example, if a child has experienced instability or a lack of trust that adults will keep their promises, they may choose the immediate reward as a way to ensure they get something, even if it is small, rather than risk waiting for something that may not materialize. In this way, the marshmallow test not only reflects individual self-control, but also highlights the importance of a safe and reliable environment that fosters trust in the future. The results of this study have had profound implications in the fields of education and psychology, as they have led to a rethinking of teaching strategies that focus on strengthening self-control and planning skills in children from an early age. Educators have noted that encouraging activities that help children manage their impulses and learn to delay gratification can have long-term benefits, not only academically, but also in the development of a more balanced and resilient personality. On the other hand, parents have found in this experiment a tool to better understand their children's behavior and to identify areas in which they can offer additional support. It has been observed that when children are encouraged to think about the future and to imagine the rewards of their efforts, they learn to set goals and work steadily to achieve them, which gives them a sense of control over their lives and reinforces their self-esteem. The marshmallow test has also been the subject of debates and criticism, especially regarding the interpretation of its results. Some researchers argue that factors such as socioeconomic environment, culture, and early life experiences can influence a child's ability to wait, which implies that the experiment should be understood within a broader context and not as an isolated measure of individual potential. However, despite these criticisms, the essence of the experiment remains powerful and revealing. It shows that the ability to wait for a greater reward is a complex skill that develops over time and is influenced by a combination of internal and external factors. Over the years, the marshmallow test has become a symbol of the power of self-control and of the importance of teaching new generations to manage their impulses, plan for the future, and value rewards that require patience and effort. This experiment invites us to reflect on our own daily decisions and on how the management of our immediate desires can have a significant impact on our long-term well-being. It reminds us that in many cases, what seems like instant gratification may not be as beneficial as the satisfaction that comes from waiting and working for something better. In this way, the marshmallow test stands as a clear example of how psychology can offer practical lessons for everyday life, promoting the development of skills that allow us to face challenges, make better decisions, and ultimately build a more promising future. Every time we find ourselves facing a temptation or an immediate desire, we can remember the lesson of this experiment and ask ourselves, am I choosing what will truly benefit me in the future, or am I simply giving in to a momentary impulse? The answer to that question can make the difference between achieving our goals or remaining stuck in the present. And it is precisely this reflection that has made the marshmallow test such an influential and meaningful study. The bystander effect, tragically illustrated by the case of Kitty Genovese, is a psychological phenomenon that shows how the presence of other people can reduce the likelihood that someone will intervene in an emergency situation. Imagine being on the street and witnessing something terrible, such as an attack or an accident, and noticing that there are many people around. What often happens is that each person assumes that someone else will help, and that diffusion of responsibility can lead to no one acting at all. The story of Kitty Genovese is emblematic in this sense. In 1964, in a neighborhood in New York, A young woman named Kitty Genovese was brutally attacked and murdered, while many neighbors who supposedly heard her screams and saw part of what was happening did not intervene or call the police immediately. This tragic event shocked society and led psychologists to investigate why, in such an urgent situation, help was delayed or even completely ignored. It was discovered that the presence of multiple witnesses created a kind of social paralysis in which each person thought, "Surely someone else will do it," or "It is not my responsibility." In this way, action is dispersed among everyone, and in reality, no one takes responsibility for acting. This phenomenon, known as diffusion of responsibility, explains why in many crisis situations a lack of collective response is observed, even when the need for help is obvious. What happened in the case of Kitty Genovese became a paradigmatic example for understanding this effect, as it illustrated in a heartbreaking way how fear, uncertainty, and the assumption that others will act can prevent an immediate response. Researchers found that in large groups, the sense of responsibility is diluted. Each person may think that their intervention is not crucial, or that someone else, perhaps better prepared or more confident, will take care of the situation. This process is amplified by factors such as anonymity in the crowd and fear of making a mistake or putting oneself in danger. In addition, indirect communication among those present through signals or glances can reinforce the idea that the situation is not so serious or that help is already on the way. It is important to note that the bystander effect does not mean that people are bad or insensitive, but rather that it is a natural human response in situations of social pressure. Our brains, in the midst of uncertainty, tend to look for cues in the behavior of others to decide how to act, and when everyone seems to be waiting, action is delayed. In the case of Kitty Genovese, the combination of factors such as fear for personal safety, the belief that others would help, and confusion about the severity of the situation contributed to an insufficient and delayed response, which unfortunately had irreversible consequences. This case has generated numerous debates and studies on collective responsibility and the importance of breaking the cycle of indifference in critical moments. Over time, awareness campaigns and training programs have been implemented to promote a culture of intervention and solidarity, especially in emergency situations. People are taught, for example, that if you witness something dangerous, it is best to act, whether by calling emergency services or trying to alert others, rather than waiting for someone else to do it. By understanding the bystander effect, we can learn to recognize those moments when collective inaction is present, and from there, make more assertive decisions. It is essential for each individual to feel responsible and empowered to act, understanding that even a small intervention can make a difference and save a life. The story of Kitty Genovese reminds us that in moments of crisis, every second counts, and that the courage of a single person can inspire many others. For this reason, there is a call for social awareness, so that indifference is transformed into action, and communities are strengthened through empathy and solidarity. It is a reminder that even when we are surrounded by people, we must never forget that the true strength of society lies in each person's ability to put themselves in another's place and respond in the face of adversity. In summary, the bystander effect, exemplified by the tragic case of Kitty Genovese, teaches us that the presence of many can, ironically, be a barrier to action, and that it is crucial to cultivate within ourselves the determination to act without waiting for others to do it for us. This lesson remains relevant today, as it invites us to question our own behaviors and to commit to a world in which solidarity and mutual care are the norm rather than the exception. Each one of us can be the change, showing that in difficult situations, individual action is the spark that ignites collective solidarity.